Today we're going to be talking about the use of Arabic dialogue in Korandje and Berber stories. Now, in much of the world, including probably the cultures many of you grew up in, the norm for folk tales is to tell them monolingually. Even if the tale involves a foreign character who would presumably be speaking another language, you still conventionally represent their dialogue in the matrix language of the tale, in English in this case. And so this obviously applies in most monolingual cultures, but it also applies in many highly multilingual cultures, such as the Miwok of California, for example. In this story, you can see a white man is talking, who presumably would have been speaking English or Spanish, but his dialogue is represented in Miwok, just like the rest of the story. This is very normal, but it turns out that quite a few cultures do not do this, and instead have a norm of telling folk tales multilingually, at least to the extent of inserting certain elements of another language. For example, in this folk tale from the Beniz Nessun of eastern Morocco, now the Beniz Nessun in their daily lives customarily speak Berber, and the body of the tale is told in Berber, marked in black here. But telling the tale, suddenly we get to the bit where the gazelle speaks, and it turns out the gazelle speaks in Arabic. It's just as if we were telling a folk tale in English, and suddenly one of the characters starts speaking in French. Now, this phenomenon is more widespread than one might think. We managed to come across several examples within Africa, at least one example outside of Africa, and there are doubtless many examples that aren't represented on the map. But in all the cases that we've observed, it involves minoritized languages whose speakers are mostly bilingual in another regionally more dominant language. However, which language that may be, it depends very much on the situation. We have cases with Arabic, but also cases with Rangi, as a fairly small Bantu language of Tanzania, and with various languages of Côte d'Ivoire, of course. Both the matrix language and the embedded language in such cases come from a wide range of different families within Africa and a wide range of areas. Now, from the fairly scanty existing literature on this, it's often indicated that the switches are mainly for formulae or songs within the story. The only more in-depth analysis that we've been able to find is by Martin Kosman for the situation in eastern Morocco, where primarily the matrix language is Berber, and the shifts are into Arabic. In some cases, this can be analyzed as an imitation of actual language ecology. Thus, in this region, peddlers normally speak Arabic, and so do peddlers in the stories. However, in most cases, it cannot be analyzed as any such thing. It's not a question of characterization of a particular character, who indeed may go on to speak Berber in other parts of the story, but rather in his analysis of setting the formula apart from the normal text. It occasionally features aspects that are not normally Arabic. In parodistic formulae, we find occasionally Berber nouns that have simply been given Arabic morphology. But this is not the general rule. Mostly the formulae are in Arabic. And as he observes, sometimes cognate formulae are found outside the region, sometimes as far east as Libya. So this gives us a starting point for looking at some varieties that were not included in this analysis, namely Korandje to the extreme south there, and Sanhaja to the extreme north in that red box. The phenomenon seems to be particularly well attested along the Algerian-Moroccan border, as you can see in this map, although it's also found further east. So the first language we're going to be looking at, Korandje, is spoken in the oasis of Tell Bela, in the Sahara of southwestern Algeria. You can see the oasis, most of it in this map. It's extremely isolated, separated from other inhabitants by a vast field of dunes extending hundreds of kilometers. And this isolation has helped to preserve a language unique in the area. So Korandje belongs to the Songhai family, the rest of which is concentrated much further to the south, as you can see on this map. And so its outlying position, over 1,000 kilometers to the north, seems to be the result of a migration during the Middle Ages. My best estimate would be around 1200 AD. And since that period, obviously, it's had quite limited contact with other related languages. It currently has probably 3,000 speakers or so, all of whom are bilingual in Arabic, as far as I've been able to tell, and most of whom are raising their children to speak Arabic as their first language. So it's in a situation of ongoing language shift. Berber influence on the language is currently negligible, but is attested to by extensive loanwords for the past.
And now we are going to Sanhaja. Sanhaja is a Berber language variety spoken in northern Morocco in the mountainous region, as you can see in this picture. And different mountains basically divide different Sanhaja tribes. Here you can see a map showing where Berber languages are spoken. They are part of Afroasiatic language phylum, and they are spoken all over North Africa, from Morocco in the west to Siwa Oasis in the east, as well as in Mauritania. There is a small pocket of Zenaga Berber speakers, and there are Tuareg Berber varieties spoken in the Sahel. Here we zoom in at northern Morocco. Sanhaja has around 85,000 speakers, spoken here in the middle between Homara, spoken more to the west, and Tarifid, the big brother of Sanhaja, spoken more to the east. Tarifid borders on eastern Sanhaja varieties, and there is a dialect continuum between Sanhaja and Tarifid. Western Sanhaja varieties are more Arabized, but all Sanhaja speakers are fluent in Arabic and Berber, regularly code switching between the languages. This map shows 10 distinct Sanhaja Berber varieties. They are quite distinct from each other, to the point that Eastern Sanhaja speakers do not understand Western Sanhaja speakers. The extreme Western Sanhaja variety is called Ketama, and this is the variety most Arabized. And they are not just fluent Arabic speakers, but they use Arabic when they sing and when they tell fairy tales. Since they are also fluent Berber speakers, they are happy to tell fairy tales to linguists interested in their language, but a certain formula, and especially songs and verses, must remain in Arabic in their fairy tales. These varieties spoken to the east I call Eastern Sanhaja. They are the least Arabized within Sanhaja, and they still have Berber songs and Berber fairy tales, but even they use a certain amount of Arabic formula. And those varieties are in the middle, so they behave between Ketama and Zarqat, being not as Arabized as Ketama, but less Arabized than Zarqat and Mezdui. And now we will look at the data examined. So we looked at 12 fairy tales for each language, 12 for Korandje and 12 for Sanhaja. The Korandje data come from Champeau in 1950s, 6 recordings of 6 fairy tales, and data collected by Lameen in 2008 to 2012. While for Sanhaja, I have 12 fairy tales recorded in the course of the last 9 years. For both languages, we found practically the same number of switches to Arabic, nearly 80. So the number is quite high. But if we looked at distinct switches into Arabic, so types and not occurrences, then the number is significantly lower, because many of the formula or phrases are repeated throughout the tale. In the case of Korandje, one and the same phrase was repeated for 29 times in the tale, which yields 29 switches. If we look at language alternations, not all of them are deliberate, because there are other types of language alternations that we will present further in the study, and we will be focusing on the conventional or deliberate language switches. And we found that majority of the stories in both languages do contain deliberate Arabic language insertions. So the question is, what's going on? So first I will present a synchronic analysis, and then we will go into diachronic. All language alternations can be roughly divided into 3 major types. The first type is constituted by performance errors. So this is a non-deliberate language alternation. Usually, if you transcribe the story with a speaker or with someone else who knows the language, they will say, oh, don't bother to write this, because this is just a mistake, and they will provide a native Sanhaja or Korandje equivalent. And we found that this category is quite marginal. In fairy tales, at least, there was only one example in each corpus. This can differ for different genres of text, of course. This type of language alternation is different because it can be within the sentence, while phrasal borrowings or deliberate language alternation usually concerns the entire phrase. So the second type that we found, which is more frequent than the first, are phrases borrowed entirely from Arabic, and sometimes it's difficult to decide if this is a code switching or it is a necessary language alternation, especially if there is no native equivalent. And finally, the most interesting type, it's constituted by deliberate or conventional language alternation. And this type is really different also in that not all Berber languages do this kind of language alternation, while type 1 and type 2 can be found in many Berber languages. So, for example, the third type, conventional language alternation, hasn't been found in Tashelhid or Tamazight Berber varieties, while the first and the second can be found in these languages as well. Now we are going to look at some examples. We skipped the first category of non-conventional language alternations because they're really marginal, so we will focus on distinguishing between the second and the third type. The borrowed phrases are different from conventional language alternations in fairy tales in that they can also occur in everyday speech. So usually people will use Arabic formula when greeting each other, when thanking each other, when using blessings, god invocations, curses, and things like this. And this will be found as well in fairy tales as well as outside fairy tales. And often they have no conventional native equivalent, or a native equivalent might exist, but it will be more rare or limited in Sanhaja to the eastern part. The second subtype within borrowed phrases is constituted by opening and closing formulae of a tale, and we will see the examples. So first, let's look at examples of borrowed wishes. We found 15 examples in Korandje corpus and 11 in Sanhaja, which is also comparable. So that will be, for example, greetings, wishes like khair alaikum, prosperity be upon you, khair merhaba, prosperity and welcome, or a curse, for example, la yatek, may God punish you and him, example from a fairy tale, but this will also be a curse used in everyday communication, not only in fairy tale. And now let's look at the opening and closing formula. We have 3 examples in Korandje corpus and 8 examples in Sanhaja Berber corpus, because in Korandje you do have a native opening formula, which is more frequent, but you also have an Arabic equivalent, hajitkum, majidkum, I told you, I didn't come to you, which has the same translation as the native one. In Sanhaja, they do not have a native opening formula. It must be in Arabic if it's present in the fairy tale. It's always msaltkum, saltkum, sir latkhaf. Once upon a time, no real translation of msaltkum, saltkum. And sir latkhaf is the answer of the audience. They encourage you to go on. They say go, don't fear. For the closing formula, which is not always present in all fairy tales, there are a number of different variants in Sanhaja. And this is one example. My tale went with the river and we stayed with the good people. It can be translated into Berber, but all over Sanhaja they say that the Berber equivalent doesn't sound as nice and it's not frequently used. While in Zarqat they have a native closing formula, and they could also use the Arabic equivalent of it. And now let's turn to the most interesting type of the language alternation, that's deliberate language alternation. This language alternation type, unlike the other two, is most frequently found with experienced storytellers. So it's not a matter of language loss or being not a good speaker. Even on the contrary, the elder speakers tend to use deliberate language alternation in stories more frequently than the young speakers. This is also visible in Korandje recordings if we compare old ones from 1950s or the ones from 2000s. We have 47 cases for deliberate language alternation in the old recordings and only 5 in the new ones, while the speakers of Korandje tend to use Arabic more recently with the younger generation. In the case of Sanhaja, I don't have a difference between old and new recordings, but I have a difference between old and young speakers. Young speakers, especially when they realize that they are being recorded and that I'm interested in Berber more than in Arabic, they are trying to keep the language pure, so they try to keep the fairy tale in Berber, and they will try to translate the Arabic verse or phrase into Berber, and the older speakers correct them. They say, don't you remember that the verse went like this? And the young speakers say, but we can provide a Berber equivalent of this phrase. So the sentences do have a Berber equivalent, but in the fairy tale, at least for the elder speakers, the more authentic version must contain the Arabic insertion. It's always reported speech, found in quotations and catchphrases, and we could divide conventional language alternation into 2 subcategories, prose and verses. And the prose is often repeated. It's the same sentence repeated 3 to 5 times in the story. Can be plain or rhythmic, and the verses are sometimes remembered by the listeners, and then they could use the verses to ask for the story. So they say, why don't you tell this linguist a story which has the song, and then they will sing the song in Arabic so that the storyteller knows which story to tell. Here is an example of prose conventional language alternation. It's a story about one smart guy who outsmarted the ogress. The ogress traps him, and she wants to kill and eat him. but he says that he's too skinny to be eaten, so he says that she should feed him for a while before eating him. And then she keeps asking him. In the matrix language, she says to him, and then the question is in Arabic, did you get fat, Hmimas? And she asks him repeatedly 3 times in this version of the story. And he first answers mzel, which means not yet, both in Berber and in Arabic. For this answer, it's impossible to state clearly if he switched to Arabic or not, because it's a loan word. But finally, for the 3rd time, he says, now, anti-ogress, I became strong and fat. So the ogress was speaking in Berber up till this point in the fairy tale, as well as Hmimas. But in these specific cases, she switches to Arabic, probably because it's a key moment in the story, and also the sentence is repeated 3 times in the story, which is an indication that the sentence must be memorized, and the answer as well along with it. And then we have an example in Korandje.
Yeah. In Korandje, we find similar prose examples. So the noticeable generalization is that the punchline of a story is very frequently in Arabic, as you can see in the last line here. The jackal, having been flown into the air by the hawk, finally comes falling down, and as he falls down, he says, what lands in the sky? So in this story, less usually, we also find several cases of Arabic dialogue earlier in the story. And this can be understood better in light of the punchline generalization. The first one, right at the very beginning, very clearly echoes and anticipates the punchline. The hawk is telling him there are lambs all over the place in the sky, so come on up and you'll eat your fill. And then, just as in the Sanhaja example, we have the reply to this Arabic phrase, also in Arabic, or at least starts in Arabic before shifting back to Korandje.
And then we have a couple of examples with verses. So this is a famous story about the goat and the kids, which you might be familiar with. The goat has children, and she instructs them, do not open the door to anyone unless you hear this song. And the matrix language here is Berber. When the goat brought them the grass, she came, she knocked, telling them, and then the song in Arabic follows, and we will listen to the example so that you can hear that it's not just the language which switches, but also the intonation, and the song has rhyme and it's poetry.
قرصنا أولادي أولادي زولوني ببالي أنا في قدراتي أربع في القراني لا حليف في سدراني حيدوا الباب يا أولادي.
So here it's also interesting to note that the language of the Arabic insertion in fairy tales is often not the same as the language that people use in everyday communication. It has some old or archaic features, and sometimes the speakers don't even realize the words which they are saying, especially if I try to elicit what the meaning of the song is. They would say, never mind, don't take it literally, it's just the words. The goat says for her kids to open the door. So they don't mind if bibani is door or doors, or the word for liqrani is not liqrani anymore, but liqran, and the word for water is not pronounced anymore as al-ma, but lima. So it's very frequent that in conventional language alternations, the language is not Arabic of the everyday speech, while in code switching, which is non-deliberate, or in phrasal borrowings, it's the same language in fairy tales and in everyday speech. And now we have a Korandje example.
Mm-hmm. And from a Korandje version of the same tale, we find much the same thing going on. The story is told in Korandje, the quotative verbs in Korandje, and then when it comes to the song that the goat sings, once again it's in Arabic, as you can hear in a second. And on that note, we come to the diachronic analysis. Now, the basic question that these language alternations bring up is, given that most speakers of these languages, both Korandje and Sanhaja, are bilingual in any case, one could imagine in principle that these switches would be created on the spur of the moment by the speakers, or just be local innovations with no connection to a broader tradition. On the other hand, the very fact that these tend to be repeated suggests some degree of memorization, which raises the question of how far back the chain of memorization goes. And so if we look at these in a broader perspective, it becomes clear that the chain of memorization goes back quite a ways, and does in fact go back to an Arabic original rather than to the originals in Korandje or Sanhaja. The first piece of evidence that strikes one looking at this is the matches between Sanhaja and Korandje themselves, which, as you'll recall, are quite a long way away from each other, spoken in very different environments, And yet, in these two recensions of the song that the goat sings in this same story, you'll note for the first line, we have a clear match. In the Sanhaja version, the w, which originally is conjunction and, has been reinterpreted as part of the name, while in the Korandje version, ma'zuza has been replaced with the diminutive ma'ziza. Ma'ziza is the regular diminutive in Arabic of ma'zuza. And the second line, modular details of dialect phonology, is in fact identical across both versions. And the remainder of the song is less identical, but still shows a clear affiliation. We have first the vegetation on goat's horns and the milk. It's very obvious that these two songs are cognate and go back to a common origin, which presumably can't have been both in Korandje and in Sanhaja, certainly. And so if we look further afield, we find matches, versions of the same thing told in Arabic alone. Thus, for example, here we find this in the exact same line in the Sanhaja version and in a version told in Algerian Arabic, hundreds of kilometers further east. But even more striking is a case like further along in the tale, and when the goat goes looking for her kids who have just been eaten, she asks various animals, and each time she sings the same song. And you'll note the rhyme scheme in iya, which is maintained in this case even at the cost of some violence to the morphology of the language. Because the dahbiya is not a normal Arabic word, which we'd expect dhab. So you'll note it opens with the self-presentation and then the horns, then whoever took my kids come and face me. All these elements are maintained in the Arabic versions, told all the way from Mauritania to central Syria, where we find the same rhyme scheme, the same structure, and in the Mauritanian version we even find the same names for the kids, as in Ma'ziza. Very clearly, so this was originally told in Arabic with these particular formal features and was borrowed into the Korandje version of the tale. Similarly, in the rather gruesome tale of the green bird, we find essentially identical wording from the Korandje version all the way to the Palestinian version, well over 1,000 kilometers further east. And so, what does this all tell us? Well, the first thing we note is that the language alternation patterns found in folk tales, in large part, parallel the ones that we find in real life. Outside of folk tales, Arabic is also preferred for polite formulae and curses and blessings and so forth. In Korandje and Sanhaja, it's also preferred for poetry and song, most of which in these communities happens to be in Arabic. It's also strongly preferred for proverbs and riddles, and proverbs in particular offer some parallel to the Korandje habit of putting the punchline in Arabic, given that the punchline of the story very often is a proverb. However, the cases of deliberate language alternation in a reported speech that's prose don't fit so well into the real-life situation, into the situation outside of folk tales. And so to account for these, we need a broader generalization, and the one that seems to apply is that in both these languages, the preferred language for memorized phrases, to be repeated verbatim rather than paraphrased, is Arabic. So we find that the instance of language alternation in Korandje and Sanhaja folktales are clearly not the result of language loss or lack of skill. To the contrary, it's the most skilled speakers and the most skilled storytellers that do it the most often. They do serve stylistic purposes in that they highlight key moments of the story, but more significantly, they serve mnemonic purposes. When a story is retold, mostly it's paraphrased. Stories are very rarely retold verbatim, but some elements are retold verbatim. The formulae, the verses, certain key aspects of the dialogue, and these bits that are retold verbatim are overwhelmingly in Arabic rather than in Korandje or Sanhaja. And, as we can see from the wider distribution of these elements, these are not simply local stylistic decisions. They reflect a reasonably faithful transmission over a very large area, and therefore over quite a long time span, from Arabic originals of these formulae. Thank you for your attention.